No say, 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 Kayleen. Welcome. No say, Kayleen. Torah and Tarot is an amazing accomplishment. I gotta say, it's a pretty cool accomplishment. But look what a vulgar cover. But look what a subtle, cool thing. I don't know if you can even see it on the camera. It's not his ass that I'm trying to show you, although it kind of is. Oh, no, see that? The tough. Now, faux, as they're spelling it there, faux, apparently is the French word for fool. Apparently we have the word fool from French, faux, unless the British and the French had a very similar word, faux. But check out that little tough there. So this tough is the main, I think, challenge and gauntlet thrown down in this project, which is an amazing project. And I'm going to say it's an amazing project for at least 3 reasons. 1, tarot is so important to people. And people is my euphemism for ladies, by the way. People, whenever I want to say anything about women, I always say people, because everything that's true about women is true about people also, you know. And tarot cards, much like astrology and socialism sometimes, and, you know, degrees of, or conversely, militarism and just, you know, responsibility and just nice things, you know, all the things that are nice, all the things that help us relate to what's happening, all the things that help us relate to the real of our lives and get some perspective about it, is, I'd say, the ironic function of the oracles. Nice. To read means to know the symbols, means to understand the symbols, and it sounds like you do. But of course, the punchline is the symbols are infinitely redefinable. And that is a lot of the joy and opportunity in symbology at all, is the responsibility of recontextualizing, you know. And this is where I think the traditions overlap and the dissonance gives way to opportunity. Be the moon card you want to see in the world. That's awesome. There's such a range of associations and transformations. And I think, if I understand correctly, I was talking to this guy, Rabbi Avram Leader. He's been doing classes about the Sefer Yetzirah for a very long time and did my favorite translation, or should I say non-translation, an adaptation of it, which was to say no translation at all, just the vowels as the suggested commentary on the whole thing, and otherwise make it super simple, like the Tao Te Ching, you know, which we also use as an oracle sometimes, the number of pages in it and sort of picking up on one, identically to how one would drop a bunch of willow plants or coins on the floor in order to kind of figure out what's coming and what's already happening, you know? Because I do think most of these oracles are less about delusions about what's coming and more about sensitivity and language around what's happening. And to this degree, I'm going to point to a big machloket between the version of the tarot calculus and narrative that's sort of described here, as far as specifically this deck, what they call the Noblesse Tarot de Marseille. And I'm just going to even read, the back here. For hundreds of years, the original meaning of the Tarot de Marseille, the artistic ancestor of the contemporary tarot, has been a source of mystery, speculation, and debate. The Torah in the tarot reveals that the Jean Noblet tarot contains an abundance of ingeniously concealed Judaica. But I say again, even in this relationship to this exact deck is the Pop-Thelemic tradition, because he's right, you know, the rider weight and its surplus of astounding symbology is based on this one. And even the imagery that Alan Moore uses for his tarot section is this one, is this exact one. I would not any different at all. It's this literal one with the sort of words of it juxtaposed to a sort of broken down, fundamentally iconic version of it without any particular ism. But here is the challenge also. Do we start with 1? Or do we start with 0? Now, the tradition of starting from something before 1 is entirely appropriate in the context of tarot, to the degree that we have tarot, according to Alan Moore, and I trust his sources, from the Turks and Saracens. Now, that could mean Egypt, right? But certainly from the Islamic East, specifically, i.e., it's not so Tibetan. And I was talking to my wife about this, and she thought about it a lot, because what they say is Egypt or Babylon. And Alan Moore, in his bumper book, in his wonderful magical bumper book, really does seem to prefer Egypt for a lot of the redactions, specifically Alexandria, and holds that a lot of the redaction of a lot of stuff happened there, including a lot of the Bibles, including a lot of the, books of Daniel, goes as far as to suggest that the entire Babylonian exile of the Bible and of the Jewish narrative was in the context of a migration to Alexandria nearby and a sort of return to Babylon from nearby. And that's meaningful, But my wife said, I don't know, doesn't look very Egyptian, that stuff to me. Lions, it's really drier, not rivers, not birds. If the tarot was originally from Egypt, you'd have birds. If it was really a commentary on the Book of the Dead, a lot more ibises. But the only birds you see are part of the chariot. Wings on people, not so much birds. There's no eagle card in that kind of way, except for the one that is already that. And let's say, as far as the archaic origins of mysticism as we have it, the sort of, now, mysticism, I don't mean mysticism. I tell a lie. Nothing to do with mysticism. This is just the order of the heavens. That's not mysticism. That's nature, right? That's just almanacking, almaniacal. Almanat, right, is to count, almanat lekabel pras, not to count, because the counting itself is a bit of a controversy. And I think this is part of the controversy of starting with 0 in the form of taf. And I'd say taf just means a check and a seal on some level, right? But it also means a finish, sof, depending on how you pronounce it. Thof is really more of a drum. Top is really more of a drum. Taf. But it really is kind of a taf, really is kind of a saf, and really is kind of a sof, because it really is kind of the end of the letters. And let's be honest, it's weird that it exists, and yet it's so fundamental to the transition between one language and the other, by which I mean Hebrew to Aramaic / Arabic, in the formation and definition of the Semitisms, or Temitisms. Should I call them Temitisms? My taima to have a tibolish, not a shibolit. Forgive me if I'm being obscurantist. Basically, the last letter in the Hebrew alphabet is taf, but in a lot of ways it should be shin, right? Shin is also a bit of a resolution to the end of an extreme, especially in the Sefer Tzira, where the 3 mothers are Alpha, Mem in the middle, and Shim all the way over there at the other end of the heavens, with Taf only emerging as the resolution of the 7 doubles. But these together are the 10 and not the 12, right? They are free of the yoke of the 12 because they are 1, 2, 3, 4, 20, 90, 200, 300, 400. Kaparet, kaparshat, right? Beged kaparet and amash can be juxtaposed, be like one just abjad kaparshat together. And then you have the 10 sfirot. And let's say part of the theology of the 10 sfirot is that you can apply them to the 12 just as easily because they are made of the 3 and the 7. And even the 7 is made of the 3 and the 4, you know, or the 3 times 3 or times, you know, minus, you know, there's a lot of ways of flipping these things. And the machine does advocate being creative with inversion in order to understand and get perspective. Hakor behem, hafoch devara buryo. You know, the Sefer Yetzirah is full of that. And the thing about the Western occult tradition, the pagan part, you know, the Hellenic part that is not the Jewish part. And this is, I think, one of the interesting historical / cognitive confusions between the Western Kabbalah with a Q and the Jewish Kabbalah with, you know, J. With the J. The full pagan stuff, like just Jupiter as Jupiter, you know, is something the Sefer Yetzirah addresses and touches upon. Addresses is the wrong word. It just sort of acknowledges and validates it. That like, oh, there's 7 planets in the heavens, and they are the original 7 doubles, and there are just a polarity of 3 everywhere that makes the heavens and makes the 3 dimensions, and you know, makes like time and quality and just the 6 directions of space, and the 7th at the center. And the 7th at the center is a recurring phenomenon. I go 6 and I come back to center, and here I am. And suddenly Libra is created. And you have this with the tarot. Like, just looking at the Shabbos. I'm just going to bring this out. I love Alan Moore very much. He introduced me to the idea of secular Kabbalah and a juxtaposition between the sort of thing that justifies spirituality in the Thelemic theological system, you know, which is the realness of the art and the realness of the patterns and the realness of the language to address the patterns, right? These are why Kabbalah is universal. But let's say the phenomenology of the tarot as such and the confusion that I have been wrestling with along my whole extended pop cartoon Kabbalah exploration project, where I've tried to understand just the patterns in general, the patterns that give way to like very familiar archetypes. Oh, it's the big 7 or the big 3, whatever. There's a couple trinities. There's a couple septatologies. Is that what you call a 7 cycle? Septatologies? Seventologies? I don't know. But the permutation of big numbers that become the tarot, that become the playing card, has a lot to do with 4 sets of 13. 4 sets, like in the 4-letter name of God, you know, like in the Inri, you know, like the 4 elements, you know, there's 4 elements and each one is like a different letter of the tetragrammaton, man, a different fundamental direction. You might have heard that already. You might not have. It might be a really big deal to think that, oh, wow, the 4-letter name of God is the 4 sides of the chariot and is the 4 elements. Because every 4 is 4. Is the 4 Ninja Turtles. It's the 4 Ghostbusters. You know, it's the 4 Beatles. 4 mothers. You know, because dynamics have tendencies. And as soon as I'm in a dynamic where I am polarized or I am the resolution in a bipolar thing, then that's the, you know, that's what I'm showing up as. That's what I'm doing. I'm there as the sort of resolution between extremes or as the extreme that demands resolution, you know, depends how you show up. But that's the difference between being the first to a party and being the third to a party. And then being the fourth who's like feels distant from the other 3 who are already at the party and has to resolve. And I think this is very much the nature of a thing happening seasonally right now at the summer solstice, which is the emergence of Cancer as a reaction to Gemini, which is the overheating, right? The heating of the world gives way. First springtime, huzzah. Then, like, the beginning of the festival season in May, and it's like, okay, celebrate and express. And then the fundamental criticism function emerges within. And that's the nature of the Hegelian negation of the negation, right? I know this from Slavoj Žižek. He quotes Marx, and Mao, quotes Mao talking about Hegel, and the sort of mystery of the resolution cycle. And Mao tries to keep the revolution going by keeping it at the stage of Gemini without going over to Cancer. I don't think this is his language. I don't think this is how they say it over in China. But I think the rest of it's very similar, right? 4 stages of Hegelian sort of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, negation of the negation, breaking of the emergence of the synthesis back into some previous cycle, which I would identify with the Divine Mother, understanding and integrity. The step besides, there is step regress to, not the 4th, but the 2nd, right? Taurus is a lot about, understanding and reintegrating, I don't mean to exaggerate. I think it's just kind of the problem with these expressive modalities that really do describe themselves as if objective and inherent, but they do, man. That is the, Neoplatonic way. And I'm sorry to use a word like Neoplatonic for something that's such a recurring phenomenon long before Plato, of just the definitions. But the tarot, famously, we all learn some fundamental definitions from the tarot. 1 is the Fool, or 0 is the Fool, but the first is the Fool. First comes the Fool, right? You can't do nothing unless you just do it. The Fool. And part of Stav's epic project is to define the Fool and the Taf hidden in the Fool as the Judaic gospel hidden in the particular imagery attached to the Noblesse tarot. But amidst this, Stav does not go as far as I kind of assumed he was going to say. Because even the Thelemic tradition of tarot attributes it to Frankists, right? To like sort of heretical Jews. And even the sort of visionary Alexandria Hellenized version of it, same thing. I mean, it's like the calendar. Why is the 7th day called Sabado in all the Romance languages? Because just like some heresy Jews just got there early on. The gig was just designed. It's like we're all calling Shabbos. It's Shabbos forever or whatever. But that's a tell here, right? The lack of 7 obsession displays as almost anti-Semitic. And I think you might have that in the sort of pan-Hellenic heresies, not heresies, pan-Hellenic orthodoxies that emerge in the wake of Babylonian mystery religion and survive into the Hellenistic era through, all their traditions, But let's say the first card is the Fool. This introduced me as a kid to the whole idea of just don't think, just go. And there's an Aries aspect to that, right? Aries is don't think, just go, right? And then the Magician, the Magus. So part of the Judaification of the Fool in this vulgar little image here, Stav says, is the cat attacking the junk, right? This is not in most other versions, you'll observe, right? If you guys know tarot cards, the Rider-Waite's, it's a dog. So much so that in Sandman, when he's going off on his walk, it's the dog that's walking with him. The Fool is guided by his delightful animal buddy, not threatened by predatory feline going after his balls that he can't see and can't begin to deal with. He's like, la, 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 da, 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 going his merry way. Doesn't seem to be falling off a cliff on that one. Doesn't seem like he's about to go off in some kind of crazy, dangerous thing. Except for the cat attacking his balls. What a maroon. And this is already, a fair suggestion of something distinctly Jewish. Not anti-cat, but he's identifying the cat with Lilith. Brings down Zohar sources. The cat is Lilith. This is a very strong and interesting syncretic conclusion, and it's based, right? Venus is the lion. That is the lion of Ishtar. Leo is actually Venus. I know Leo is ruled by the sun, but it's Venus being ruled by the sun, in the same way that Cancer is, I don't know, being ruled by the moon, but is not the moon. It's like, it's a crab, man. I'm going off on a tangent. I want to talk about what I deeply appreciate about the tarot that, let's say, comes through in both versions. And what I'm fascinated about that Stav does that I think is like a question amidst a thing, because he makes a strong conclusion, it makes a strong argument, but it's such a radical thing to start with tough. I guess that's tough luck, right? There's a lot of jokes in the tough here, right? Because it's tough luck. Because the theory is the Inquisition was pretty tough. And here the tough is this. You can see it better on the paper one. The tough is disappeared into the ass and legs of the man. He is the tough. He is the they say in military parlance that your whole self is your ass, and everything that is yours is your shit. And this is a little bit, everything that is yours is just poop, and everything you are is just ass, in the sort of most vulgar way. And I think that is being suggested there, right? As opposed to a sublime, aloof, primordial existence in the Aleph before existence through foolishness, which is the artist's way, the artist's path. Just do it and then read about it afterwards. And here becomes the difference and schism to some degree. Let's say if the magician is one, or if the magician is two, right? So we learned in Star Trek that number one is the second in command. And I think you have this in the Torah, very much so, right? It starts with Bet, Bereshit bara Elohim. The whole Torah, every page of every new book of the Torah, the Mishnah, starts on the second page, Bet. Because you build from a Bet. The Aleph is a little before. So the idea of Bet as one and Aleph as zero is very sensible, right? Because Aleph isn't even really pronounced, right? It's the vowels give it way that it's O and A. But A, this is the initial proto-vessel before vowels. So it would be fair to say zero. But let's be honest, Aleph is one. When you put like an Aleph amount of things, it means there's one. There really is an Aleph. I really am saying Aleph, as opposed to the unsayable sound I'm not saying, right? The vowel without any Aleph to animate it, rather than a, let alone a ba and a be and a boo and a bay and a bay. But let's say the magician as B, the magician as, that's right, ain't no way like the way. But forget about the way. Let's say the ve and the bay as the Bet, as two, as inherently feminine. Now, this is part of the challenge of the theology described in the Sefer Yetzirah, where the Bet is the beginning of the seven doubles, and thus associated with like Saturn in a lot of versions, Saturn and wisdom itself, as the base, as the feminized base. I guess you could say Saturn is not so gendered. I guess on some level, yeah. Saturnalia, right? Is it gendered, the parity? There's a level where it's sort of not, right? There's a level where it's the Uranian and it's beyond any kind of identity, right? Atik Yomin, the full sort of grandparent Saturn, where it's just hunger and it's not localized. But no, on the other hand, let's say Robert Anton Wilson, when he turns the 7 into the 5, syncretizes Mars into Saturn, because Saturn is very masculine. Just judgment. But there you go again. In traditional Jewish Kabbalah, judgment itself is more feminine than masculine. And this challenge of redefinition goes, I want to say all the way up, but I tell a lie. No, this challenge of redefinition, it's neighborhood to neighborhood. It's on the bottom in the context. Now, in relating to the magician, Alan Moore even tries to say the magician is Keter. And the fool is the thing before Keter, right? Because Keter is created. Keter is created. And I think this borders on a controversy, right? Is Keter created, or does Keter only create? Now, in the liminal pre-creation described in the Sefer Yetzirah, nice, you should. It's great. Start from the beginning, go through it slow, take your time. But let's say the Sefer Yetzirah introduces the Talmud, because the Sefer Yetzirah is a Mishnah that explains the rest of the Mishnahs. And the Talmud itself is just a continuation, I shouldn't say continuation, but elaboration of the context of the Mishnah. Could be good to start with the Mishnah because the Sefer Yetzirah is from that context. And they all do a thing like this, where the first chapter is functionally incoherent, and then the second chapter explains everything going on. And the Bible's a little like that, right? The first chapter is like, whoa, and the second chapter is like, okay. Hate to exaggerate. But let's say the magician as one rather than the magician as one. It's one either way in this system, right? Because even when the magician is Aleph, like in the conventional noblette that Stav is describing, and I have to assume his description is not an innovative thing. He tries to prove every single one by showing a Hebrew letter in the shape of the letter that should be associated with the given card picture, and argues this is part of where it's hidden. Look, she's doing a nun. That angel pouring water into water is doing a nun. Temperance. But here's a little bit the opportunity and I think crisis of thinking too hard about the letters. Because let's be honest, a lot of Hebrew mysticism is just about the letters and what they mean. And what they mean is so rich in a way that suggests having come together in that natural way things do, where they become perfect by dint of just their naturalization of each other. And the example I'm going to give is day and night, right? There's a kind of a perfect day and night cycle where a certain amount of hours are day and a certain amount of hours at night, and they share throughout the year from the winter solstice to the summer solstice. And this creates something like a reliable system of 12 hours and 12 hours, right? AM and PM. Like our modern version of it is kind of like a sort of ossification into something like an objective standard. But you'll observe dances across objective standard because sunset and sunrise used to define how long each hour was. The hours used to be very relative, but the day was always broken into 12 cycles because it was just very convenient. Because that way you could do until the sun set, until the sun middle is 6, count on your way up, and then breaking it down into just sort of thirds, quarters. And this is part of what's nice about tarot as a spiritual accomplishment on the level of astrology, where a system that invites expansion into detail also invites return into unity contemplatively for the sake of perspective, get some perspective. And this is the challenge of the 7 and the 3, to say nothing of the 12. The 12 are already not experienced as divinities. They're almost more like all just tragedies, all those 12. But the 7 sure are divinities. They're infinite powers leading and guiding each of the 12 as priorities. And then the 3 are an even more refined sort of pre-version that gives way to even the nature of the 7, which is to say, each of the 7 has a good and a bad version. And then a balance in between. That's somehow, the spectrum, the mean rather than just the range. So going through Stav's deck are so many little accomplishments as far as contemplative experiments in relationship to the cards. Right. So the nice thing about tarot is the hope of an elaboration that is consistent, but it's a challenge and problem because the 12 in the system start from 5. And doing that here works also. And this is where it gets a little challenging, right? Doing it a few different ways, right? The popus, la pepes, the, what do you call her in the other language? I want to say the hierophantess. I'm like, the priestess? No, I think the priestess is a different one, if I remember correctly. Right, the priestess. Nope, that's what they call it. The sorceress is already 2, but she's the 3rd card. This is already consistent, but this is also pre-creation. I impulsively want to associate this with the entire proto-lunar that gives way. And has to predate the hay as we have it. And from there, it's a mystery, right? It has to predate the hay as we have it, which then emerges in the Empress. Now, I'm going to go through all of these one by one because there's a lot here. He makes a strong argument for each of these, right? The bet as the Popus, he can find it inside of her, just the shape of her as she sits. And it does reconcile the problem of Bet as wisdom. The Vilna Gaon does not believe that the Vet is Saturn, even though the classical order would go Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sol in the middle as life and death, as the Chaf, Venus, Mercury, Luna. No, the Vilna Gaon puts Luna at the top with wisdom. The whole thing originates in the original cycle of creation and has been observed by everything that lived since all of history and all of time, but emerges as sort of playful language specifically amidst alienation, which is where we are hoping to educate each other through renaturalizing games. And I do think this is the origin of tarot as a sort of play game, specifically at borders. You know, my theory is that it was specifically at the border that the trafficking of cards goes as a sort of interstitial border play introduction game. He connects the Popus, the Priestess, the Bet to Miriam. Now, Miriam's got to come up again because she's so Mem and Resh bound. But he's really talking about the whole thing, the basis of the whole thing, the home of the whole thing. The home of the whole thing starts in the feelings, which is why I think it does want to come back to the moon. Part of what's nice and part of what I liked about Alan Moore's Moon and Serpent bumper book is that he really connects the whole of mysticism to the moon, which I think does resolve a lot of the Judaic association with the moon, the Davidic association with the moon, and the magical association with the moon as core reintegration priority. He goes with it to explain just the things that are in there, but doesn't play a word game the way you could with the letter base. Somebody who does is Perry Farrell on his album when he did a sort of Happy Birthday Jubilee album. Busy, 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 busy bees making things. Exactly. How does that hook it tape, man? It taped pretty good, actually. The moon gives so much clarity because it grounds us in the core of ourselves. And this is the main hope of cards, symbols, idols, stories, right? Look at ourselves in something that is not quite a mirror and thus get clarity about our feelings, which is why the moon is so associated with our internal selves. You know, my moon sign is the true self, you know, and my sun sign is just, you know, how I roll. And my ascendant is like, you know, that's just how I grow. And so it's a lot of how I'm experienced, let's say. And this pattern keeps bouncing, right? The real tradition is to associate an entirely different card called the moon with the moon and with Pisces, you know, and from then on, gives the Empress to Esther and Gimel. But in the Sefer Yetzirah, the Gimel, as the second of the two doubles, already offers to be Jupiter, right? Gemalani Koltov, who gives. It starts to vary a lot. And I asked Avram Leader about this, and his argument is just that everything is cycling through cycles. Everything is going through phases. And so we're all operating on a certain amount of each of these. And a lot of the names of the paths, of the details, has to do with the stops we make along the way. And this is the way back into something like a monolatry or mono experience, and even something like a monotheistic commitment, let's say amidst. Let's say a lot of the Crowley model in Thelema is do a monotheism for a minute, do a hot monolatry until you get a response, then switch, and then get some perspective about the overarching real before. The all in phases, yeah, as above, so below, and so without. So I want to go through all of these, and there's 22, right? I'm doing a very quick glance at each of these until I get to the fifth, because that's really what I've been trying to talk about. The fifth, the sixth, the seventh, the eighth, and ninth, specifically the transition between the eighth and the ninth, which is the transition between Gemini and Cancer, the thing happening in the season right now. But I'm already being silly when I say that. By definition, Gemini to Cancer is the transition from 3 to 4. But no, there's a few other ways to start the cycle. Starting the cycle 3 before it starts is true, because 3 before you see is probably there and can be retroactively understood. And this is part of the tradition of associating the moon with the creation before creation. Because let's say the original Kabbalistic Jewish myth about how the moon got to where it is about the unfairness of the original creation and a sense of wholeness in pre-creation. Before gender and before the sun and the moon as such are divided, they're already talking. And the moon points out that we can't share two crowns, right? This is also a little bit the Saturn moment, right? Saturn tries to hold all the stars together, eat them all, keep any creation from happening. And that's why it's Saturnalia, right? He's so hungry, he doesn't want there to be anything but himself, right? So he eats all the kids, doesn't want there to be anything but himself in pre-creation. And I think this is part of the argument about how much pre-creation is the moon and how much it's Saturn. You know, before one, what do you count? Because whatever it is, sure did have a lot to do with how we got to where we are. Now, the moon and Saturn are very similar in that they're both the most cold and isolated extremes away from the center in the menorah. In the medieval Kabbalah of Itzhak of Akko, Eliezer Kalir, no, yes, Itzhak of Akko, the difference between all the planets, they're defined in terms of the three, in terms of hot and cold, wet and dry. The lower you are and thus closer to the earth, the wetter you are. But the further you are from the heat center of the sun, the menorah, the center is the shamash, the heat center. And then the closest to it are Mars and Venus, right? Venus is wetter. Before the division of gender, those are the days. But let's say shortly after the division of gender, Mars and Venus differentiating from the sun in terms of just which one is wetter, because Venus is wetter, bless her heart, you know, because she's closer to the earth and thus closer to the moon. And Mars is drier and just as hot. This is like a dosha system in medieval Kabbalah of Itzhak of Akko, which I love because he explains it in his commentary in the Sefer Yetzirah. I haven't seen any other Western authors try to do that, how we get to the 7 main divinities from the 3. But you see how it goes. He goes on to say, you know, Mercury and Jupiter, very chill, very temperate, very balanced, defined by how balanced they are, but Jupiter's more alienated. That's why joviality is a little more alienated than business and language, you know, both very temperate, but like thievery is like a little wetter than, you know, a vibe, a jovial vibe, a commanding sort of presence, you know. And then it's the moon and Saturn, right? The moon is the coldest and the wettest, just like us, you know. And Saturn is the coldest and the driest, hence the most alienated and hungry and like wizened and alienated. And you'll notice in Egypt, Saturn only rules over the next world, you know. It's a little bit of a slur when the Romans suggest that the god of Israel is Saturn. And that was Saturn Dionysus, you know. It's a little bit of a slur because it is the Saturday trip, but it suggests that it's about, you know, judgment and alienation, which I don't think was responded to well. I think it was responded to with the whole theology of insistence that no, the God of Israel is not just one of the 7. He's above all the 7. All the early pre-civilizations praise Saturn. Saturn is the old god. Saturn is Orion on some level, right? The original Orion before history. Thanks for listening, you guys. I'm going to stop here and come back in some time. Cheers.